What if the most powerful empires of our era no longer need armies to conquer nations, but only balance sheets, currency flows, and financial pressure applied at exactly the right moment? That question has unsettled historians, economists, and intelligence analysts for years, and yet few dare to confront the possibility that modern geopolitical victories are being engineered not on battlefields, but inside central banks, sovereign debt markets, and international institutions that shape the fate of entire nations without ever firing a shot. The real shock is how quietly these mechanisms operate, how clean they appear compared to traditional warfare, and how often countries fall without realizing the invasion has already begun. There is a moment in every financial conflict when a nation believes it is still sovereign, even as its key decisions are already being guided by forces outside its borders. That is the invisible threshold where influence becomes control. Modern empires understand that bullets create resistance, but liquidity creates compliance. A military threat unifies a country. A financial crisis divides it from within. And somewhere inside that division, power shifts so subtly that most citizens cannot trace when the takeover began. The truth is that financial warfare did not emerge accidentally. It evolved from centuries of observing which weaknesses break nations faster: currency instability, external debt, reliance on foreign investors, dependency on a dominant reserve currency, and political elites who underestimate how these forces interact under pressure. By the time leaders recognize the pattern, strategic leverage has already changed hands. What makes this even more unsettling is how predictable the sequence is once you can see the architecture behind it. But here's the twist few people expect. Financial wars rarely start when a crisis appears. They start years earlier when institutions quietly reshape a nation's incentives, steering it toward decisions that look rational in the short term but catastrophic when the pressure finally arrives. That is why countries fall not through dramatic events, but through slow, unnoticed shifts that prepare the ground long before the first shock hits. And once the pressure begins, every vulnerability becomes a weapon that was planted in plain sight. You may have lived through moments like this without realizing their geopolitical significance. A sudden currency crash that seemed random, a wave of foreign capital entering and exiting your country at the worst possible time. A bailout promising stability but demanding concessions that rewired national priorities. These events rarely feel like acts of war, yet their consequences reshape nations more permanently than most military conflicts ever could. If you have witnessed anything like this, you know exactly how unsettling these patterns can be, and if not, what you will uncover next may surprise you. And before we dive deeper into the machinery behind these silent conquests, tell me in the comments if you have ever questioned why some nations collapse under financial pressure while others rise through it, because understanding that difference is crucial. If this opening already sparked something in you, leave a like to help this message reach more people and make sure you are subscribed, because what comes next reveals how these invisible wars actually unfold, setting the stage for everything that follows as we continue this investigation into the true power structures shaping modern empires. From the moment a nation believes financial turmoil is just an economic problem and not a geopolitical strategy, it becomes vulnerable to the oldest transformation in modern power, the shift from military dominance to economic control. This shift did not happen overnight. It emerged slowly as global powers realized that soldiers are expensive, invasions are unpredictable, and public opinion can turn a military victory into a political defeat. But money, currency pressure, and debt obligations can quietly achieve what armies cannot, reshaping the decisions of governments without mobilizing a single battalion. The fascinating part is that this transition began long before our era, rooted in observations of how markets can destabilize or strengthen states, depending on who steers the flow. As global trade expanded, so did the understanding that influence could be embedded in the very system countries depend on. When nations tied their economic lifelines to dominant empires, they unknowingly accepted the rules those empires created. What looked like cooperation was often compliance. A country that relied on foreign credit or anchored its currency to a stronger power gradually surrendered one decision after another, justified as necessary adjustments or modernization steps. Yet behind that cooperative facade, the foundational dynamics of conflict were being rewritten. Instead of front lines, there were interest rates. Instead of battle cries, market signals. Instead of territorial occupation, financial dependency. The real turning point came when global institutions emerged to formalize these mechanisms. Under the promise of stability and integration, they introduced frameworks that appeared neutral but consistently favored nations that controlled the flow of capital. This subtle shift changed everything. A country could be pressured, corrected, or redirected without any public confrontation. Its policies could be shaped by external expectations. Its budget priorities could be influenced by creditor demands. Its long-term strategy could be quietly rewritten by forces that did not have to justify themselves to its population. And the more interconnected the world became, the easier it was for powerful states to exert control while maintaining the image of cooperation. But what most people miss is that financial warfare became dominant not because empires chose it, but because the world made it more effective than traditional conflict. Digital markets can react in seconds. Investors can move billions with a click. A sudden change in bond yields can destabilize a government faster than any military maneuver. The battlefield expanded to a scale no army could match, and the weapons evolved into algorithms, credit ratings, currency swaps, and liquidity injections. Nations learned that if they did not adapt, they would be left at the mercy of those who mastered this new environment. And as these systems matured, another pattern emerged, one even more revealing. The actors shaping geopolitical outcomes were no longer only governments. Financial institutions, sovereign funds, multinational corporations, and even speculative investors gained enough influence to determine whether a nation thrived or collapsed. Their motivations did not always align with political stability. Their decisions could spark crises, accelerate booms, or trigger abrupt reversals. Once this realization took hold, the true nature of modern conflict became clearer, setting the stage for understanding how vulnerabilities are engineered long before tensions become visible, a dynamic that continues unfolding as the deeper layers of these hidden wars come into focus. Once nations began to understand that modern conflict was shaped by forces beyond military borders, another realization emerged, one far more unsettling. Vulnerabilities are not simply discovered by external powers. They are often engineered over years through incentives that appear harmless at first. A country might open its markets believing it is entering a new era of prosperity, unaware that it is also exposing itself to leverage points that can be activated later. And this process rarely feels like manipulation. It feels like opportunity. Low interest loans, infrastructure partnerships, access to global credit, promises of foreign investment, each presented as a step toward development. But within those agreements lie the seeds of dependence that future conflicts will exploit. What makes this engineering so effective is the illusion of control it creates. Leaders may believe they are diversifying their economy, improving financial stability, or modernizing essential sectors. Yet every decision deepens a structural link to external actors, ties that become constraints when geopolitical tensions rise. Currency exposure becomes a tool of pressure. Supply chain vulnerabilities turn into bargaining chips. Debt structures that once seemed manageable become pathways for influence. In the background, empires map these weaknesses with precision, waiting for the moment when activating them will reshape a nation's choices without appearing coercive. The most revealing pattern is how these vulnerabilities often align with internal ambitions. Local elites seeking rapid growth, political stability, or international prestige frequently accept terms that shift long-term risk to the population. Strategic industries are open to foreign acquisition. Public budgets become reliant on external financing. National currencies become subordinated to international markets. These decisions do not feel like surrender. They feel like progress. But progress built on external pillars collapses the moment those pillars are removed or restructured. What complicates matters further is how these engineered weaknesses intersect. A country with high external debt is more sensitive to changes in bond markets. A nation dependent on imported essential goods is more vulnerable to supply disruptions. A state whose currency relies on investor confidence can be destabilized by a single downgrade. Each vulnerability amplifies the others. Empires understand this synergy well. They do not need to apply pressure directly. They only need to influence the triggers that force a nation to react. And once reactions begin, the internal system often unravels faster than any external intervention could achieve. The deeper twist is that many nations believe they can outmaneuver these risks by playing multiple powers against each other. But diversification does not eliminate engineered vulnerabilities. It multiplies the points of influence. Competing empires gain leverage simultaneously, each watching for moments when internal tensions weaken resistance. By the time governments notice the convergence of pressures, the architecture of dependence is already complete, setting the stage for the next, more visible phase of the conflict where debt, currency instability, and political concessions will collide in ways that reveal how thoroughly the ground was prepared long before the crisis becomes public. As the architecture of hidden vulnerabilities takes shape, the moment eventually arrives when pressure is no longer subtle. Debt, once presented as a path to development, becomes a mechanism of control that tightens quietly at first and then all at once. Nations begin to realize that repayment is not the real objective. Influence is. Terms can be renegotiated, but the underlying leverage remains, shifting the balance of power long before any crisis becomes visible to the public. And what makes this stage so effective is how it disguises itself as economic necessity. Governments justify austerity, asset sales, and policy changes by pointing to external obligations, never acknowledging how those obligations were designed to ensure compliance rather than financial stability. The most striking pattern is how debt traps are rarely accidental. They evolve from cycles of lending that expand during optimism and contract just when a country becomes most dependent on continued access to capital. Lenders appear supportive for years, encouraging projects and expansions that bind a nation to expensive future commitments. But once the nation is locked into a structure it cannot sustain, the tone shifts. What used to be cooperation becomes conditionality. What used to be partnership becomes oversight. The narrative shifts too. Suddenly, a nation's internal challenges are framed as evidence that external guidance is necessary, and this framing justifies increasingly invasive economic reforms. This is where the psychological dimension becomes impossible to ignore. Debt pressure does not just reshape budgets, it reshapes identities. Governments lose the ability to pursue long-term strategies because immediate compliance becomes the priority. Citizens feel the consequences through inflation, unemployment, and reduced public services, yet the root cause is often hidden behind technical language that obscures the geopolitical implications. Meanwhile, creditors gain the authority to dictate domestic policy through the logic of financial responsibility. It is a transformation so deep that a country can appear independent on paper while functioning as an economic colony in practice. Another layer of this pattern reveals itself when nations attempt to resist. Efforts to renegotiate terms, default strategically, or pivot toward new alliances often trigger market reactions that intensify the crisis. Currency value drops. Investor confidence evaporates. Bond spreads widen. Each reaction reinforces the message that deviation from imposed rules is too costly to consider. And within that feedback loop, governments begin surrendering decisions they once considered untouchable. State assets are privatized under pressure. Infrastructure is handed to foreign operators. Regulatory frameworks are rewritten to satisfy external expectations. At this stage, it becomes clear that the debt trap was never about numbers on a balance sheet. It was about shaping the choices a nation could or could not make. And if you have ever seen a country struggle under these conditions, or lived through a moment when national policy felt driven by invisible forces, share your perspective in the comments because the collective experience helps reveal patterns that often remain hidden behind official narratives, opening space for deeper understanding as the next layers of this story unfold. When debt pressure tightens around a nation, it is rarely the only force at play. The next layer of control emerges through currency power, a mechanism far more subtle and far more destabilizing than most people realize. The value of a nation's money is not determined solely by its productivity or stability. It is shaped by global markets that can amplify or crush confidence in a matter of hours. Empires have learned to wield this dynamic as an instrument of influence, guiding capital flows in ways that reward aligned nations and punish those who attempt to resist. This is where financial warfare reveals one of its most powerful tools, the ability to dictate outcomes without issuing a single directive. A currency under pressure does not just weaken purchasing power, it weakens political stability. When exchange rates fall sharply, governments scramble to defend their economies, burning through reserves and imposing emergency measures that signal vulnerability to the world. Investors interpret the panic as justification to withdraw even more capital, creating a self-reinforcing loop that accelerates the decline. Behind the scenes, dominant powers monitor these shifts closely. A well-timed statement, a change in interest rates abroad, or a sudden reallocation of institutional portfolios can intensify the strain until a nation is forced into negotiations it would have otherwise avoided. But the real twist is how reserve currencies transform this battle into a one-sided contest. Countries that hold global reserve status enjoy a structural advantage no competitor can match. They can print money to stabilize their economy, absorb massive deficits, and extend influence abroad without immediate consequences. Their currencies become safe havens in times of uncertainty, drawing capital away from weaker nations at the exact moments those nations need liquidity most. This pattern repeats during crises with almost mathematical precision. As fear rises, money flees to dominant economies, leaving vulnerable states exposed to sharp contractions that magnify their dependence on external support. Another layer becomes visible when we consider how currency alliances shape geopolitical strategy. Nations tied to a dominant financial system often adopt policies that align with the interests of that system, even when those choices conflict with domestic priorities. Pegged currencies amplify this effect, locking nations into structures they cannot adjust without triggering massive instability. The illusion of stability lasts only as long as global conditions remain favorable. When they shift, the peg becomes a trap, forcing countries to defend an exchange rate that no longer reflects economic reality. In that struggle, they gradually exhaust the very tools they need to maintain sovereignty. And when liquidity dries up during global turmoil, the hierarchy becomes unmistakable. Nations at the top of the monetary order absorb the shock. Those at the margins suffer the consequences. Access to swap lines, emergency lending, and geopolitical alliances determines who stays afloat and who spirals into crisis. These outcomes are not random. They follow patterns rooted in decades of structural dominance, patterns that reveal how currency systems are wielded as strategic assets long before crises erupt. As this unseen battlefield expands, it becomes clearer how financial power reshapes the choices of nations, preparing the ground for the internal conflicts and political fractures that emerge in the next phase of this silent war. As currency dependence deepens and external liquidity becomes the lifeline of a fragile economy, another mechanism of control begins to surface, one that operates from within rather than from outside. Financial wars do not succeed solely because foreign powers exert pressure. They succeed because internal actors become aligned with the very forces that weaken national autonomy. Elites, often without malicious intent, play a decisive role in this shift. They respond first to global incentives, then to domestic expectations, and finally to the quiet but persistent signals that indicate where power truly flows. In these moments, the battlefield moves from markets to institutions, and influence spreads through relationships, agreements, and policy, frameworks that appear technical on the surface but are deeply geopolitical underneath. Many governments facing currency stress or mounting debt begin welcoming external advisors whose promise stability but embed long-term constraints into the national agenda. These advisors help shape reforms that restructure state assets, redefine regulatory systems, and shift ownership of strategic industries to actors who are better aligned with dominant financial powers. What is often presented as modernization becomes a transfer of control through procedural normality. Laws change quietly, oversight bodies evolve, budgets are redirected, and each of these steps gradually reduces the state's capacity to act independently when geopolitical tensions rise. The striking twist is how cooperative this process usually appears. Local business groups align with global investors to access capital they desperately need. Politicians support reforms to maintain credibility with international markets. Technocrats implement measures that fit perfectly within global standards. None of these actions feel like surrender. They feel like prudent governance. But when layered together, they create internal pathways through which external power can influence everything from infrastructure priorities to monetary policy. A nation may still hold elections and pass legislation, yet the range of acceptable decisions shrinks dramatically without any formal declaration of control. This internal realignment accelerates during times of crisis. When the public grows restless, elites seek stability at almost any cost, accepting terms that they previously would have rejected. Privatizations, once debated for years, are approved in weeks. Foreign ownership caps are lifted quietly. Long-term concessions for ports, energy grids, or telecommunications infrastructure are transferred to entities linked to external strategic interests. Each concession is justified as necessary to prevent collapse, but collectively they reshape the very core of national sovereignty. What makes this stage particularly destabilizing is how invisible it is to most citizens. The population feels the effects through rising prices, reduced public investment, and a shrinking social safety net, yet they rarely see the financial maneuvers driving these outcomes. As frustration grows, political polarization deepens, creating openings for further influence. External actors no longer need to apply direct pressure. Internal divisions do the work for them. By the time the nation realizes how thoroughly its institutions have been rewired, the next phase of the conflict is already unfolding, one in which crisis becomes an opportunity for even deeper restructuring that will chart the country's trajectory for years to come. As internal institutions shift and external influence gains traction, the landscape becomes primed for the moment that transforms pressure into outright control. The engineered shock, crises, rarely emerge from a single trigger. They unfold through a convergence of vulnerabilities that were quietly assembled over years, waiting for the right conditions to ignite. When currency instability deepens, political fractures widen, and external liquidity tightens, even a small disruption can cascade through the system. This is the stage where empires act most decisively, not by launching attacks, but by allowing the fall to accelerate just enough to force a nation into a position where choices narrow to a single predetermined path. What makes these shocks so effective is their ambiguity. They can appear as natural market corrections, global downturns, speculative attacks, or sudden shifts in investor confidence. But beneath the surface, there's often a precise choreography. A downgrade here, a withdrawal of capital there, a public statement that subtly questions a nation's stability. Each action amplifies the others until fear becomes self-sustaining, pushing leaders into panic-driven decisions that surrender long-term autonomy in exchange for short-term relief. In these moments, the shock reveals its real purpose, creating an opening through which external powers can reshape the nation's economic architecture without facing resistance. The most striking pattern is how rapidly this restructuring unfolds once the crisis takes hold. Policies that were politically impossible become unavoidable. Measures that would have sparked outrage become accepted as necessary sacrifices. Strategic assets are sold under distressed conditions, enabling foreign interests to acquire critical infrastructure at a fraction of its value. Long-term contracts lock future governments into obligations that reflect priorities far removed from the public interest. The crisis becomes the justification for decisions that permanently alter the balance of power inside the nation. Another twist emerges when we examine how these shocks affect social dynamics. As living conditions deteriorate, the public becomes divided not only along political lines, but along narratives about who is to blame. Some accuse internal corruption, others point to foreign manipulation. Still, others adopt the official narrative that austerity is the only solution. These divisions weaken resistance, making it easier for external actors to finalize the restructuring process, while citizens argue among themselves. Once fragmentation takes hold, the path forward becomes shaped not by democratic debate, but by whichever forces hold the financial leverage needed to stabilize the situation. And as the shock evolves into a controlled recovery, many believe the worst has passed without realizing that recovery is often the phase when sovereignty is redefined most profoundly. If you have ever lived through a period when a crisis seemed to rearrange your country's priorities overnight, or felt that decisions were being made far above public understanding, share your thoughts in the comments. Because these personal insights help illuminate how deeply these shock patterns embed themselves in national history and how much they shape what comes next. Once the engineered shock restructures the internal system, a nation enters a new terrain where the instruments of power no longer resemble traditional geopolitical tools. They are quieter, faster, and capable of shaping national behavior with a precision that past empires could only dream of. Central banks become pivotal actors, not merely regulators of monetary stability, but enforcers of global financial norms. Their decisions on interest rates, liquidity injections, and reserve management can either stabilize a struggling nation or push it further into dependency. And what appears to be technical policy often carries deep geopolitical intent, signaling who aligns with dominant financial systems and who risks being pushed to the margins. Sanctions introduce another layer of this invisible battlefield. They present themselves as corrective measures, targeted responses to political disagreements or violations of international expectations. Yet their real power lies not in the punishment itself, but in the message they send to the global market. When a major power imposes sanctions, it rewrites a nation's economic future in a single moment. Access to capital shrinks, trade routes collapse, credit ratings fall. Even countries not directly involved adjust their behavior in fear of becoming collateral damage. Through sanctions, modern empires project influence far beyond their borders, using financial isolation as a weapon more effective than most military strategies. But the twist that catches many nations off guard is how institutional narratives shape the perception of these measures. When a dominant financial system labels a nation unstable, risky, or non-compliant, the label itself becomes a tool of enforcement. Investors internalize it, markets react to it, international institutions build frameworks around it. Suddenly, a nation finds that defending its reputation becomes as critical as defending its currency. The burden of proof shifts entirely to the weaker actor, while the stronger one shapes the narrative with language that appears neutral but carries immense influence over global capital flows. Reserve strategies further complicate this dynamic. Nations that rely on foreign reserves to defend their currencies often underestimate how fragile this defense becomes during coordinated pressure. Reserves look powerful on paper, yet they can evaporate within weeks when deployed aggressively. In contrast, countries that issue reserve currencies never face this dilemma. They defend themselves with liquidity that the world accepts automatically. This imbalance ensures that in times of crisis, dominant nations survive, while weaker ones are forced into negotiations from a position of desperation. What makes this stage of financial warfare particularly striking is how interconnected these tools are. Central bank decisions shape global liquidity, sanctions shape trade behavior, institutional narratives shape investor psychology, reserve systems shape the hierarchy of who can withstand pressure and who cannot. Once these mechanisms converge, a nation realizes it is no longer navigating isolated economic challenges, but an entire architecture designed to influence its path. And at the moment, it attempts to break free or pursue an independent strategy. The next phase of conflict emerges from within and outside simultaneously, pushing it toward choices it never intended to make. As these mechanisms tighten their grip, The global landscape begins to resemble a battlefield in which nations fight not for territory, but for financial breathing room. By 2025, the patterns are no longer hidden. Liquidity flows act like troop movements, capital flight resembles strategic retreats, and coordinated monetary decisions shape outcomes with the precision of military operations. What becomes striking is how openly these dynamics play out while remaining invisible to most citizens. Nations at the center of the financial system leverage stability as a strategic asset, while those on the periphery struggle to maintain autonomy in a world where every misstep invites immediate repercussions from global markets. Some countries attempt to resist by forming alliances, pooling reserves, or building alternative payment systems, hoping to reduce their exposure to dominant powers. Yet each move triggers reactions that reveal the hierarchy of influence. Bond yields rise, capital inflows slow. Rating agencies adjust their outlooks with language that subtly reinforces existing power structures. These shifts do not need to be coordinated to be effective. The architecture of the global market operates like an ecosystem that instinctively protects the interests of those who shape its rules. Even nations that believe they are diversifying often discover that their new partners come with their own dependencies, creating a web of obligations that is even harder to escape. The most revealing twist is how quickly fortunes change when global confidence shifts. A country that appeared stable 6 months earlier can suddenly face a liquidity crisis triggered by distant events. A geopolitical conflict in one region ripples across continents, draining investor appetite for risk and exposing nations that were already walking a tightrope. The collapse rarely begins at home. It begins in the reactions of global actors who decide, consciously or not, that supporting a nation's stability is no longer advantageous. And as funding dries up, the nation finds itself negotiating from a position that reflects not its intrinsic strength, but its place in the global hierarchy. Another layer emerges when examining nations that rise through these conditions instead of falling. They succeed not because they avoid vulnerability, but because they anticipate how external powers will weaponize economic pressure. They diversify reserves before shocks hit. They fortify institutions to withstand speculative attacks. They cultivate alliances that offer protection without demanding total alignment. Their survival becomes a testament to understanding that financial warfare is not a temporary phase, but the defining strategic environment of the modern era. Yet even these nations face limits because no amount of preparation can fully shield them from systems built to favor those who already dominate. As global tensions deepen, the divide between nations gaining influence and those losing it becomes unmistakable. Some governments quietly expand their reach by acquiring distressed assets from weakened states. Others strengthen their currencies through coordinated agreements. Meanwhile, nations that fail to adapt drift toward crises they cannot control, driven by patterns far older than they appear. And as this silent struggle intensifies, one final question emerges. What happens when the dominant financial empire faces the same pressures it has long imposed on others? And how will the world respond when the system built to maintain order begins showing signs of strain that no institution can ignore? As nations struggle within this silent battlefield, a final and uncomfortable truth begins to take shape. Even the dominant empires that built the financial order are not immune to the very pressures they deploy. Every historical system of economic control eventually reaches a point where its internal contradictions outweigh its external advantages. The empire that once dictated the terms of global liquidity starts facing the same vulnerabilities it exploited elsewhere. Debt accumulation grows faster than productivity. Political polarization erodes institutional credibility. Strategic rivals innovate new tools to bypass long-established monetary structures. Confidence, the true foundation of any reserve system, begins to fracture, in places few expected. And the world watches closely, sensing that a shift long predicted but rarely acknowledged is finally taking form. A declining empire does not collapse suddenly. Its influence weakens gradually, then accelerates as other nations recognize the opportunity to reshape the global order. Trade alliances pivot, reserve compositions shift. Central banks diversify quietly, signaling their doubts long before public discourse catches up. Even small nations adjust their strategies, no longer assuming the old monetary hierarchy will remain unchallenged. What once felt permanent now looks fragile, and fragility invites competition. As alternatives multiply, the empire that once expanded its reach through economic leverage finds itself defending positions it never thought would be questioned. The most revealing twist emerges when analyzing how crises inside a dominant power affect the global system. When smaller nations fall, the world adapts. When the financial heart of the system trembles, the shockwaves reach every corner of the global economy. Liquidity tightens worldwide. Risk premiums rise sharply. Emerging markets face renewed pressure. Rivals sense openings and test boundaries. The empire, accustomed to shaping crises, becomes the epicenter of one. And in that moment, the patterns that govern decades of geopolitical dominance begin to shift rapidly, creating new winners and new losers across a landscape that no longer follows the old logic. Yet what defines this transition is not a dramatic event, but a steady erosion of trust. Once markets doubt the longevity of a reserve currency, once allies question the consistency of leadership, once rival powers create credible alternatives, the global order enters a stage where outcomes become unpredictable. This unpredictability changes the behavior of nations everywhere. Some accelerate reforms to protect themselves. Others hedge by aligning with multiple spheres of influence. A few attempt to rewrite the rules entirely, hoping to position themselves at the center of the new financial architecture that will emerge when the old one inevitably recalibrates. And as you reflect on everything we uncovered through this journey, if you felt this exploration opened your perspective on how modern empires rise and fall through financial power, leave a comment with the phrase, "I see the pattern now." It helps deepen our conversation and shows how these ideas resonate with you. If this series of insights added value for you, a like would mean a lot. And subscribing ensures you stay connected as we continue examining how global power really works beneath the surface. There is another video here that expands on these ideas in a way that complements everything we have explored together. So if you want to keep following this thread, click and continue with me there as this story keeps unfolding in ways that shape the world we all live in.